All right, so there's no new announcements for the course other than a reminder. We have exam 4 starting tomorrow. So with that, we'll go ahead and turn it over to the group. If no one has an immediate quick question, I will make I guess a comment that there were some email questions about calculations because there's some stuff about competition and predation. So for this exam, you will not be expected to do any actual mathematical calculations. You might have to understand some of the calculations conceptually, but it will not ask you to calculate the levels of competition or predation or anything like that.
Can we go through like an example of what a question might look like for the predation or what we might have to be able to analyze?
So it could be something along, sorry, what was that?
No, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, I was gonna say it might be something along the lines of predator-prey cycles. So if one population, say predators, increases, you might expect to see a blank, an increase or decrease in the prey cycle or in the prey population. So conceptually, like one would go up or down, you don't have to calculate what the size would be.
So will we know, like, I think there's what would make a stable population. It's like P equals R divided by C. So like those, will we just kind of have to know those, if that makes sense?
I mean, trying to,
Or will like a question be like,
it would be
is
more
this
conceptual than that.
Okay.
It's not going to give you, I'm trying to think of an example without giving something away. So as far as competition, one thing that might be worth going over is are these figures right here.
Okay, yeah, I need help with those.
Yeah, so there's some math equations on here, but that's not as important as understanding them conceptually, like given different scenarios. So as a group, why don't we go through what these 4 different blocks are telling us? So what are the 2 axes for all of these figures? What's on the x-axis and what's on the y-axis?
X-axis is species number 1 and y-axis is species number 2.
Yeah, exactly, right? So that's N1 and N2. So when we say species 1 and species 2, that's correct. What do the N's stand for?
The number in the population.
Yeah, exactly, right? So the size of the population or the number of that species of the given population. And then what else do we have on the axes? Like what are these dots? There's 4 dots on these axes. What do those represent?
So for, well, let's pick one. So like for A, the K2 divided by beta, that's the species 2 population is 0, correct?
Yeah, what is K then? What does that
That's the carrying capacity.
Yeah, so K is the carrying capacity.
I chose the like hardest one to start with.
So that's fine. Like I just wanted to break these down a little bit.
So like at K2 up at the top left, that one's it's at its max carrying capacity.
This one over here?
No, still on A. So
over here. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, like that one, K2 will have reached its carrying capacity or population species 2.
And then why is K1 an open circle?
That's because the whole entire ecosystem has reached equilibrium there.
Yeah, right. So that's our point of equilibrium. And that point of equilibrium is when we hit K1, the carrying capacity for species 1, right?
Yeah.
And then what are these lines called? The green and the purple lines?
They were isoclines, right?
Yeah, those are the isoclines for the species. And does it matter what happens depending on where we start in this population?
Yes.
What happens if we start down here in the yellow? What direction are we going to go in the figure?
Towards the top right, because nobody's at their carrying capacity yet.
Yeah, so both populations are below carrying capacity, so they're both below their isoclines. So you can almost think of this as kind of like a boat on a river in a sense. It follows the arrows, right? So population 2 is going to grow, population 1 is going to grow, but what that's going to do is that's going to hit, it's going to meet in the middle, and that's why we have this middle arrow, and it's going to go this direction. And then when one passes its isocline, the species 1 is still below its isocline, it can go this direction in competition. And what happens when species 1 reaches its carrying capacity? What happens to species 2?
Looks like it's extinct.
Yeah, right. So how we're reading this is if we're here at equilibrium, species 1, we go from left to right because that's on the x-axis, that increases its numbers up to its carrying capacity. But what happens when we go down this isocline is species 2 is on the y-axis, and that now over here is dropped to 0. So this is an instance where species 1 outcompetes species 2 and drives it to extinction by reaching its carrying capacity. Are there any questions on how to interpret what's going on in this figure? And then conceptually, what's happening in figure B then? What's the outcome of competition in figure B?
It's at the opposite. Species 1 outcompetes species 2.
Well, it is the opposite, but who hits their carrying capacity?
2.
Yeah, so it's the opposite of A. So it's here we have species 2 reaches its carrying capacity and drives species 1 to 0. So species 2 outcompetes it because their isoclines flipped, right? And then in scenario C, what's happening? This is a little bit different than A and B.
So for this one, depending on where you start, either could outcompete each other.
Yeah, exactly, right? We have 2 open circles, so we have 2 possible scenarios for reaching carrying capacity, so we have 2 possible outcomes of competition, right? If we start down here and go into this blue box, species 1 is going to win. And if we start up here and move into this blue box and push this way, then species 2 is going to win. So this does depend on where you start, what the numbers initially are essentially of species 1 and species 2. So say they're equal, but then there's some type of storm maybe, and it affects species 1 more negatively than species 2. It's put species 2 in an advantage. It's likely that species 2 is going to be pushed to outcompete it then. What about in scenario D? What is happening here? We only have one open circle, so we only have one scenario for equilibrium, but it's not on either of the axes this time. What does that mean?
They're going to coexist.
Yeah, so this is potential for these 2 species to coexist. Where do they coexist as far in relation to their carrying capacities?
For this one, it looks like their carrying capacities are like below half for both of them.
Yeah, exactly, right? So they're coexisting because neither species has reached its carrying capacity. So they have to coexist, they have to be held at lower than maximum numbers.
So that equilibrium could kind of shift around. It doesn't always have to be exactly like that, correct?
Yeah, this could shift around because as we learned in the previous unit, carrying capacities can change based on different like abiotic or biotic factors in different seasons, right? So if we have a drought, the carrying capacity might drop for both species or it might drop more severely for one species. If it's very plentiful, abundant resources, both carrying capacities are likely to also to increase. So like, these are kind of like populations in time, like a snapshot in time kind of picture. But yeah, theoretically, like you could have this, these could be the same species, and in 1 year, this is where the isoclines are, and species one is more dominant. But if, say, the abiotic conditions change to favor species two the next year, you might have a flip in the results in competition. So it really depends on what's driving the competition or limiting one species compared to another.
So theoretically, like for image D, the carrying capacity could be heavily like, say, or species one could be really close to their carrying capacity, and species two could be somewhere else on their carrying capacity, but like, so like the bow tie, I guess, would be skewed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be where they intersect, but that could get, like you're saying, as a bow tie, it could be dragged to the left or to the right, depending on how those species interact to their environment. It does have to be below both equilibriums to, or below both carrying capacities to be at equilibrium. Because we think about competition, if one species at its carrying capacity, what does that mean for resources?
They're almost maxed out.
Exactly, yeah, they're using the most of their resources, that there's little wiggle room to, they can't grow anymore. So if one is using up all the resources, there's not going to be resources for the other one. And that's why when one hits carrying capacity, the other tends to go to extinction because there's no resources left over for them. But if they're both below their carrying capacity, neither are using all of the resources, and they can coexist either at the same number. Generally, that's what happens, or for short periods of time, it can drift in one direction or the other. But if it doesn't drift back to that equilibrium, it'll tend to drift towards the favor of one species. It'll grow and grow, and the other will decline and decline.
I don't know if we're going to need to go this in depth, but are we going to need to know, like, if, say, the alpha coefficient is, I know because I read somewhere, if the alpha coefficient has to be less than 1 in order for competition to occur. So like an alpha coefficient of like 0.99 would mean like would that mean that it's a stronger competitor?
Yeah, you can judge them, their level of competitiveness based on their coefficient value. Yeah, one is maxing out and anything below that is slightly below. But if one is 0.9 and the other is 0.3, you could make a prediction without doing a calculation in which one is more likely to win out.
So the one that like the example D right there, looks like it would probably be about a 0.5 maybe.
That was,
Or I guess maybe a little less than that.
it's hard to judge because we don't have a scale on here. But
I was just trying to like, I guess it looks kind of like it's a third of the way up there.
that's true. I mean, you can kind of judge, like I would say, a third or a half, but that level of prediction is possible from there, depending on where it is on the line.
but we want to look at it for the individual's carrying capacity, correct? So like for K2 is like 2/3 of the way up to its carrying capacity, whereas actually no, so is K1.
Yeah, here in this example, they're the same.
Okay.
Because I think it's just trying to simplify it, and it won't be, it'll be, you'll see these 4 figures potentially on the exam, so. This is good. Are there any other questions about these types of figures or how to interpret them?
Do you mind going over C? I kind of was away from the computer during that explanation.
All right, so going over C. All right, so what do you see in that one? Why don't you maybe practice explaining it a little bit?
So understanding from the top ones, so the population 1 reaches carrying capacity is the bottom right circle, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. I don't understand the arrows. I think that's what's throwing me off.
So the arrows essentially tell us what direction we're going. I mean, my brain sees this as kind of the blue, it looks like a river to me. So it's like a boat on top of the river, right? If we start in the bottom left, it's telling us that we're below both isoclines, we're below both carrying capacities. Both
Okay.
populations have room to grow. So that's why you have this bottom arrow going to the right for population 1, that can increase in number. And here population 2 can also increase in number. So we're going to go, both populations grow. We're not going to go straight up or straight right. We're going to go on some type of middle angle trajectory. And depending on where we land, if we cross this isocline first, we're going to then go down to the right where species 1 is going to win out. If we cross this isocline up to the left and end up in the upper left blue, we're going to go up to the left following the arrows, and that's eventually going to equilibrate where species 2 wins out and reaches its carrying capacity.
So that's where you were saying there's 2 different.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
This one has 2 different possible outcomes of competition. So the way
Okay, that
to
makes
think of
sense.
these, there's what is the outcome of competition is going to be the generic question associated with these 4 figures.
Mm-hmm.
There's, based on which one you see, there's going to be 4 different scenarios that can happen. And these are a little simpler because you can only cross a specific isocline going, in the same direction. So this one is always species 1, this one is always species 2. And then this one, as we mentioned, can be either depending on which population kind of grows faster.
Okay, I get it now. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Sure. And to relate that, if the population grows or shrinks at the same rate, they're going to end up at this intersection and reach equilibrium where they can coexist. But in this one, it's going to tend to drift to the left or drift to the right because they're not going to grow or shrink at the exact same rates. And the winner, whoever grows faster will likely win out. If you shrink faster, you'll likely lose out.
Okay.
I just want to make sure I understand what an isocline is. And when we were looking at a graph, is that essentially the carrying capacity for like if there's X number of species 1 and X number or Y number of species 2 and they meet on that isocline, is that like the carrying capacity given different numbers of species 1 and species 2?
Yeah, it's gonna have to drift towards the isocline. So like if both of them overshoot their carrying capacity, they're gonna be in this region, or at least one of them is, and it's got to go down. So that's why it has to always push. This is the maximum isocline. It has and you can see like it's further, so it has a greater carrying capacity than species 2.
Yeah, okay.
So it's in relation to their population and carrying capacity. Their population size in relation to carrying capacity. The greater the isocline, the greater the carrying capacity can be.
Got it. Thanks.
Can I ask about identifying, it was in T18, one of the activities about food webs, identifying the keystone species? Because I kept getting the wrong species on that one.
Sure, so which specific activity was it?
It was in T18, it was like the critical thinking food webs, not the activity food webs.
All right, so I think this is one of the critical thinking, right?
Yeah, that was one of them.
For this one, it picked, I think it was, where is it? Killer whales.
Killer whale, yeah.
Yeah.
But I had picked the Arctic cod because I felt like it was the most connected to everybody else, but said that it was more about keeping other predators in balance, is that correct?
Yeah, so the first thing I'll say about this is there's no necessarily absolute right answer. You know, there's biological arguments for some species that are greater than others. So if you see something that's on the exam and you provide a good counter answer, you know, there's a good probability of getting partial or full credit after the fact. But the way to think about this with keystone species is a keystone species is a species that other species greatly depend on in the environment. And if you remove them, it's going to have large scale rippling effects in that environment. And not always, but a lot of times, keystone species are they're some level of predator, if not the top predator. Because part of being a predator is you eat organisms below you. And if there are many competitors below you and you predate on them, the one that grows the highest is the most likely to be predated on in a lot of cases. So if you switch from, one prey to another, and those prey are competing against each other, you're keeping those competitors at lower than their carrying capacity and kind of keeping them in balance. And if you remove that keystone species, you might have a dominant competitor that they will outcompete the rest of those competitors. So there's a couple of moving parts in what makes a good keystone species.
Hence the web versus the chain.
Yeah, exactly.
So
sorry, go ahead.
no, I went down like a little rabbit hole in my brain too, because I was like, you could like, I started to think, well, no, because if you remove like the zooplankton or something, then nobody else could survive above that. But that's not what the keystone species is trying to insinuate, right? It's insinuating something higher up the food chain.
Yes. And usually, like I said, keystone species is going to influence levels of competition below them. That's one of the things to look for. So we say if we remove phytoplankton, right, it has a huge rippling effect because it takes the food source away from this, and it could destroy the system, but it's not keeping anything in check. It's just being used as a food source. Versus if we remove the killer whale, right, there's going to be levels of competition below that. I think between the harbor seal and the ring seal, there's going to be unchecked competition that could get out of hand and could lead to one species outcompeting the other species, and therefore removing multiple species from the system if they drive them to extinction, like in the previous exercise we were looking at.
Can we look at the one after this?
Sure.
Next one?
So this one, I think number
Because
one.
I think I stared at that picture for like half an hour. Because I couldn't really figure out who was competing with each other in this one.
So if we look at this one, I think is talking about who eats the fly, right? So we have turtles eat flies, frogs eat flies, and dragonflies eat flies. So these three species are competing against each other for food of the fly. And what the feedback is saying is if we remove the snake, it's going to let the potential frog grow in its population, which is then going to be able to put a lot more pressure on the dragonfly as well as the fly and potentially outcompete the turtle. So it could drive the dragonfly and the turtle to extinction by removing the snake. And again, like I said, this is not, you could make an argument, I think, for another organism in this figure, in my opinion.
So could you maybe like come up with it, like, because I think all of the examples kind of had the top predator in the ecosystem almost be the keystone species, because like the killer whales are the top predator, like wolves in Yellowstone were the top predator, and in this one the snakes are one of the top three. Is there an argument for one of the lower ones?
I mean, I think, let's take a look. What if we go back one step? What does the trout eat? It eats prawns and it eats carp. Do they have, and there's the prawns and the carp are competitors for the algae. So it's affecting 2 levels of competition here, and it's a food source for the kingfisher. But you could argue this is affecting 3 levels of competition with removing the snake. So 3 is larger than 2. So as far as like an impact, comparing them, I would argue that the snake would be more likely to be a keystone, say, than the trout. But I think that's the method you would use to like make an argument.
So working your way back and seeing who has the largest effect.
Because if we go back further with the frog, that's, we have the 3 competitors here for the fly. The frog eats the fly, which is also in competition with the slug, the fly, the carp, and the prawn. All are in competition for the waterweed. So you can see how it's having that large rippling effect, even if we go back 1 more trophic level.
I think I initially picked the turtle as the keystone species in this one.
And there's some argument there as far as the competition, right? Because the turtle, it eats the fly, it also, which is a competitor with the slug, the carp, and the prawn for the waterweed. So I think there's ground to make some argument that has an important effect on the ecosystem, and there's a rippling effect by removing it.
Yeah, I had said that it keeps the slugs in check, which allows everybody to have enough of the waterweed.
So you will see this concept on the exam, but I'm rather that you would show, or anybody would show, that you have a conceptual understanding. So say you get the answer wrong, if you can make a biological argument that we just talked about for, I don't, there's room for partial to full credit, even if the original answer was marked wrong, based on the reasons that we've been talking about. Because I don't think there's any absolute correct answer here. Because again, I mean, just even the wording, do you expect to be a keystone species? It's not asking which one is the keystone species, because you can argue, for more than one organism potentially. In cogbooks, if this was a higher level potential course, even, there are mathematical equations that you can, be given certain values for these organisms, calculate actually what the effect on the environment is in terms of potentially fitness or feeding rates or something like that you can make a mathematical argument. But we're not getting into that part. So it's on the conceptual side, there's a little bit of wiggle room for arguments.
I did have a question on the objective learning goals. On
Sure.
question number 12. It said, identify a species that causes apparent competition between other species that do not consume the same food. And I'm wondering, do they want us to come up with an example that makes them look like they're competing even though they're not eating the same food source?
Yeah, so this could be like given a food web, which species could be potentially causing apparent competition, and they could say that doesn't have the same food source. So you have to follow the arrows to first see which ones don't have the same food source, and then pick from there and make an argument for it. But since we're talking about this, why don't we, maybe as a group, talk a little bit about what apparent competition is again? Why don't we review that? Does anybody want to give a shot at what apparent competition is?
I don't want to like dominate, but nobody else is jumping in there. So apparent competitions when they appear to be competing for a resource, but they aren't because there's a third party species that is causing them to appear as if they are competing. But it like the example in cog books had the parasite with the pheasant and the partridge, I think.
Partridge or quails, the two birds, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so a key thing you hit is there's three organisms involved, three different types of organisms. In the example in cogbooks, we had the two birds, like the pheasant and the quail, and they were living in the same environment, but the populations were fluctuating between the two birds. So it looked like if you just saw the birds, like over time, one population increased and one population decreased, or just one just decreased. It looked like one was outcompeting the other. But when they looked closer, they found out that actually what was driving the difference in the two populations was the third party organism, the parasite, where one of the birds was able to have the parasite on it and it didn't affect it very negatively. So it did, the same or maybe a hair worse, versus the other bird did really poorly when it had the parasite. So it was actually the parasite was driving it. So with the word apparent, it's meaning what appears to be competition. So you can't see that, or you think that the two are competing, but really it's a third organism that's driving the change in the population of one of the original organisms. There any questions about apparent competition, or is there anything that anybody wants to add to that example?
For that one, I was just trying to think of like an example because it had specified do not consume the same food. So they would be competing over like a nesting site or something.
Yeah, it could be a different resource that they're competing over. It could be territory, space, like you said, nesting sites. Like I said, on the food web, you would just have to identify where you have two, like probably at the same trophic level, so on the same that would be the same like row essentially, but their food sources would be different. So the arrows would not go to a common food source, they would go to 2 different food sources.
But because they're on the same trophic level, they're competitors technically.
Yeah,
So like that could be an example of apparent competition. Is species that are in the same level, but they're not competing for the same food source.
yeah, because this one just got real specific about a food source. You could have competition for a number of different factors. So, all right, if there's no immediate question right now, I do want to take some time there are some email questions about certain images that I want to bring up because the images on the exam are going to be pulled from cogbooks. So why don't I'm going to share my screen and we can just make sure we all understand what is actually going on in these images. So for this one, for instance, what's happening in the top left image?
Mutualism.
Yeah, and why is that a mutualism between this fish and this? This is a sea anemone, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't say, but it looks like I would imagine the fish kind of uses the sea anemone to like hide from predators. I think it also cleans the fish. I don't know.
No, you're absolutely right. Mhm.
And then so the anemone, I guess, would get maybe whatever they're cleaning off the fish is maybe a food source, I would guess.
Yeah, so exactly right. The fish uses the sea anemone as a source of protection because it will shock or sting other animals that come near it, but it won't shock or sting the fish. And then the trade-off is the fish then is a messy eater essentially and provides food for that sea anemone. So they both have a plus here because in a mutualism, both species benefit. So what about what's going on in this top right picture?
That one's probably competition.
Yeah, right. We've got African wild dogs and a hyena, and it looks like they're kind of squaring off, and they're probably either fighting over territory or fighting over a food source nearby. So that would be competition. And is competition positive or negative? Both positive, both negative? Depends.
Both negative.
Yeah, so why is competition generally both negative, even though sometimes one organism wins?
Probably because of the energy that they expend to compete with the other species or resources that they have to use.
Yeah, so energy is one factor. What's another factor that could happen during a competition, especially if you've got 2 predator organisms competing violently with each other?
Injury.
Yeah, you could win the fight, but you might get injured. You could win the fight, but you might get an infection and die from that. So there's a lot of cost with competition, which is why it's viewed as generally negative for both organisms, even if one wins the resource. Because on average, it's costly on multiple levels. But what about this picture here? So what are we looking at?
2 varying species of birds with one species parasitizing a nest.
Yeah, how is a bird a parasite species?
Some birds are known to put their eggs inside of nests to then have that other species of bird brood their young.
Yeah, so as a parasite bird, that's a positive, right? And as the host bird, that's a negative because it can be a negative for multiple reasons, right? Say this bird laid its 5 eggs. That's what it wanted to do or physically was capable of doing. The parasite added a 6th egg. So now the host bird is going to feed 6 eggs instead of 5. So it's got to allocate some of its resources away from its own offspring to this parasite bird. Parasite birds, such as bronze-headed cowbirds or brown-headed cowbirds, whichever one this is for this nest, sometimes will come in and remove a host egg to replace its egg. So even you lose double resources, right? You lose one offspring and you lose resources that you're going to give to that offspring to that host bird. So it can have multiple, it can be negative in a couple different ways. That's parasitism. And then what's the difference between herbivory and predation? Like why are these pictures both not predation?
I think it's the food source. Usually if the food source is like a plant of some type, it's considered herbivory.
Yeah, exactly. Herbivory is just a very specific type of predation. They're both technically predation, like the deer are being predators on this plant, but because it is a plant, is the prey species, we call it herbivory. And that again, remember, that's positive for the one eating because it gains the resource, and it's negative for the plant because it's essentially being eaten alive and losing its own resource. And then predation is the same thing, but cogbooks is going to, when they say predation, it's going to be an animal eating an animal. Herbivory is going to be an animal eating a plant for the same reasons. And then we said this one up here was competition already. There was another couple pictures I do want to make sure we get to. So I think, does everybody understand what's happening in this picture? I think the rest of these are pretty basic. So if somebody wants to say what's going on right here with the bird and the capybara, I always forget what they're called.
Wouldn't that be mutualism?
Yeah, this is mutualism. And why is it mutualism?
Because the bird is feeding or cleaning off of, I think they said like insects or something. So the bird is feeding off of, A is feeding off of B, but B is getting cleaned by A.
Absolutely. So A is gaining food, so nutrition, energy, and B is losing potential parasites, right? Or insects that are biting it. Yeah, exactly. We already talked about all of these.
I did have a question about the hippo one.
Sure.
I know that it's competition, but in one of these it said if the species increases and what would happen to the other one, and I was like kind of, well, they're the same species, so that didn't make sense.
That's a very fair point. I think this one, right? Well, okay, not this exact question, but hypothetically, if it says what if species A increases, what will happen to species B? If they're both hippos, yeah, I mean, I can't tell a hippo species apart. It's possible they're different species of hippo, as far as my knowledge goes. And we should, just if one increases, it's going to be more negative, and the other one's likely going to decrease. It's
So
not
for
the
the
best
sake of-
example for these because I can see that being confusing, thinking, aren't they both hippos? Yes, they are.
So for the sake of answering the question, we would assume that they're different species.
That would, yes, if it asks you if one species increases compared to another species, assume they're different species in the picture. All right, so what's going on in this picture right here?
Would it be predatory?
Yeah, right. We have a spider eating a dragonfly, so it's a predation. And then this one is, I had to look this up the first time I taught the class too. Does anybody know what we're looking at here?
Looks like different species of barnacles.
Yeah, exactly. And it's what interaction is happening here?
They're competing over space.
Exactly, right? So what it is you have B and A are two different species of either barnacles or bivalves or something along those lines, and they're competing for surface area on the rocks where water washes over, where they can get wet and they can get food sources and access the sun too. So if you see this picture, just know that it is competition. Because conceptually, once we know that, we should be able to answer some questions about it. And then this was one that I got a couple emails about too. So what's going on in this picture?
Predation.
I can see how it looks like that, and that's exactly why I want to talk about this. It's not predation.
I think it's parasitism, or however you say
It's
it.
parasitism. These are some type of sea lamprey that latch onto and essentially suck some of the blood out of the fish and act as a parasite. So they get the nutrients from the fish, and the longer they keep the fish alive, the more nutrients they will get. And that's why parasites sometimes kill their host, but it's not ideal for them to kill their host, or at least not rapidly. So this is a form of parasitism with lampreys feeding off of the fish.
I got that one wrong because I thought they were cleaner fish.
And that it could look like that potentially too. I agree. I wish they would at least give the species so that we could Google the species and then the species interaction and find the answer outside of cogbooks quickly, where they could just give us, an explanation too. So, but that's exactly why I wanted to go over these pictures. So if we see them again, we can understand better what's happening. And then what about this picture? What's happening here?
It's mutualism, right?
It is a mutualism, but why? What are the benefits both are getting?
Butterflies getting food and the flowers getting dispersal.
Dispersal of what?
It's pollen.
Exactly, yeah. That's what flowers do. They give off a food source to attract insects or birds, and they come in, they get their food, they eat, they get covered in pollen, and they go to another flower and they pollinate the different flowers. So it helps the flowers reproduce, and it costs them a little bit of food. So, but they both get a benefit towards their fitness for it. This one again, it's pretty little more obvious of the choices where we have herbivory, the animal eating on a plant. Those are all the ones that I wanted to go over. Is there anybody had any other questions about any of the other images? So it kind of recycles a lot of these images. So these are ones we've all talked about.
I have a question. Going back to the food web, why wouldn't it be a polar bear? Why would it be the killer whale? Because I thought it was the polar bear.
And the short answer is it's possible that it's not. You could make an argument for the polar bear. So I would ask you, if this is an exam question, I would ask you, what is your argument for the polar bear? Go back to. So if we see the polar bears right here, we see that the polar bear is a predator on the harbor seal, it's a predator on the cod, it's a predator on the ringed seal. So it feeds on multiple organisms. And the harbor seal it feeds on the Arctic cod, and the ringed seal also feeds on the Arctic cod. So the ringed seal and the harbor seal are competing for food. So the polar bear is feeding on two competitors. So I think there's definitely grounds for it. If we look at the killer whale, it feeds on the harbor seal, the ringed seal, and the harp seal, which all feed on the Arctic cod. So there, a counter argument would be that there's 3 competitors of the Arctic cod that the killer whale influencing, where the polar bear is only influencing 2 competitors.
Okay, I see that now.
So I think the polar bear is important. And again, this, there's room to make some argument for that. But it's just try to see how many competitors it's interfering would be a good strategy to kind of look at when we're looking at keystone species.
I had question regarding the functional, sorry, I just lost it. Where'd it go? Functional response of predators. They had like 3 different functional responses and a graph.
Yeah, so these, right?
Yes.
Yeah, so why don't we talk about them? So they're called type 1, type 2, and type 3. It would probably be worth knowing what a general description is for each one, or how to interpret these figures. So what do we have? Let's start with the axes again. What is on the x-axis?
Density of prey population
Yeah, so as we move to the right, what does that mean for the density of prey population?
is going up.
Yeah. And then on the y-axis, so it says the number of prey consumed per predator, and that goes up as we move up. And then we have 3 different shapes, right? So the first one is just as the density of the prey population increases, you get a steady increase of the number of prey consumed per predator, and then there's a sharp turn off. And that describes it as what, the satiation point, I think? Yeah. So it's an increase in the prey density until the predator is satiated. Versus a type 2 is similar. It goes up, but it's a gradual decline that ultimately plateaus. Right? So it's a more gradual shift in behavior. And that has to do with, I think, does it say handling time? Yeah. So that has to do with, they must spend more time handling the prey. So this doesn't assume really any handling time because it's an increase that's constant. This, because it's not constant, that curve is due to differences in handling the prey. Then what about a type 3? Why is this? This is like almost like an S-shaped curve. What's happening there?
The consumption is rapid.
Slow to start and slow to finish, but
Yeah, so when the density of the prey is low, the number of prey consumed is low. So it's not a very efficient predator at low levels of prey. But once the prey reaches a certain level, it increases its population, or it increases its consumption. So there has to be like almost a minimum threshold of prey for this predator to really thrive or capture that prey. Whereas these two, they do it pretty well from the start. This one is not very good of a predator at low densities. But once it reaches a higher density, you get a sharp increase, and then it kind of tapers off again because of the increased handling time.
so would
So
it
are
be
we only looking at when it's slow and high? Because I have in my notes that consumption is rapid when prey population density is moderate. So would
I would
that
agree with
be like
that.
in the middle?
The steepest part of the curve is at when it's moderate. That is correct. As we see,
Okay.
it's low. The slope is lowest when the density is the lowest, and it increases. And then there's the inflection point somewhere around here, where then the slope goes the other way and starts to slow down. So that's a good statement to make, that it's the highest consumption rate when the density is intermediate. Yeah, and then it talks about spend more time handling prey and becoming satiated, and when that why it plateaus, and this has it do it at the same level.
I had written down that the second one have to have more practice. Like the predators have to have more practice.
I think that's in reference to type 3.
And it could be, because that could be why it's not an efficient predator at low density levels.
I think it said it in the text right below. Because that's how it's organized in my notes, but it's I was trying to read that on the graph though, and like compare it to the one on the right. And is the top part of the right, like first type 1 where it plateaus, is the slope down where it plateaus on figure B?
So, okay, so figure B is a proportion of prey, so it's not, this is just like raw numbers, and then this is a proportion based on the population, and because this is a constant increase, it's gonna be a flat line, and then it decreases sharply. Like the proportion of prey does not increase anymore, so that the proportion drops, right? And then that's why there's that flat line and the kind of the smooth curve, versus this is a smooth curve the entire time because the proportion changes, the slope changes with the density. And then this is a low proportion up to a high proportion that then tapers off. As we mentioned, it starts slow, at intermediate, it's high, and then it tapers off. So that's why this is also a type of S curve too. It's just a matter of reading what the y-axis is asking, right? And it relates it, like the raw numbers, what it looks like proportionally in this one.
So what's the difference between proportion of prey consumed and number of prey consumed?
Proportion is like an 8 out of 10. So it's not, this could say like it eats the number of prey, this could be, it eats 10 prey when the density is at 20. This could, that it eats 15 when it's 25. So these are going to be whole numbers, and this is going to be a proportion of, so proportions usually it's not it's less a value of less than 1 up to 1. So you could eat, 4 out of 5, 5 out of 5 is full proportion. 4 out of 5 is not full proportion. It's a proportion of the total number based on the density.
So then for the type 1 at the beginning, it's eating everything? Like the 5 out of 5?
Possibly, it doesn't have numbers on here. It could be 5 out of 5 if it's super efficient. It could be 4 out of 5. It's going to be a higher, closer to 1. Yeah, and then getting back to what someone brought up a comment about, why this is low if it needs practice. It talks about 3 different reasons why predation could be not efficient in that low numbers, or when the prey is at low numbers, right? So this is saying when it's at low density, the prey can hide in refuge, so it's not very visible, so it just can't find it. And the second one, it talks about they have less practice catching the prey, and it talks about creating the search image, that they learn more about what their prey is over time, and then they become more efficient. And then the third factor is that one. So that's prey switching. So if it gets used to feeding on one prey, it gets good at it, but if it switches, it's going to drop its ability to capture that prey. and it's gonna have to practice essentially again on that different type of prey. And it might switch based on which is more abundant. If they're more abundant and easier to get, it's gonna go probably after that prey. And if they deplete that and another type of prey becomes more abundant, they might switch to go after that one while the other one recovers its population.
Okay, so that was those three factors all relate to type 3 functional response.
I don't think they necessarily relate to type 3. They can, because they're capturing them, at low numbers, at low densities too. It's just not quite as low. So I think it's a general, this is a general that can relate to more like this section of the graph. Why are they all low when prey populations are low?
Okay.
Another topic might be worth talking about a little bit is indirect and direct effects. So the example it kind of gave here was we have a fish, a larval dragonfly, adult dragonfly, a pollinator, and a plant species. So what do the solid versus the dotted lines represent in this type of figure? That represents the direct effects or the indirect effects?
Yeah, I think the solid lines are like direct and the dotted lines are indirect.
Sure. So we can see, I think direct effects might be a little more straightforward, right? The fish eats the larvae or the larval dragonfly. So a direct effect is a direct interaction between two organisms. In what is an indirect effect then?
When like, I think the best way I can describe this is like, so if there's an absence of fish, they eat less larvae, so more larvae turn into adults, which then like affects the pollinator. So it's not like the fish is having a direct effect on the plants because they don't interact necessarily, but its lack of presence or more present like will have an effect on the pollinator or the flowers, for instance.
Yeah, so there's some type of intermediate species that it maybe directly interacts with. So how can the fish have a direct interaction with the larvae? How does that indirectly affect the adults?
Can you repeat the question?
So we know that the fish has a direct interaction with the larvae, but there's a line indicating that it has an indirect effect with the adult dragonfly. How would we describe that indirect effect? How does it affect the adult dragonfly's population?
Well,
The
when it,
more, the more larvae it eats, the less adults are produced.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, right? So if it eats larvae, every larvae it eats cannot grow and turn into an adult. So it can, by eating more larvae, it can shrink the adult population, but it does, once the adults are established, it doesn't affect it because it doesn't eat the adults, it only eats the larvae. That's the direct part. But now how would we go one step further to having it maybe all the way to the end? Let's go. How does the fish indirectly affect the plant? Like what is the process to get there? Why is it essentially beneficial to here? Why is it beneficial to the plant?
If I remember correctly, I think that do adult dragonflies eat or do something or with the bees?
Yeah,
So the less adult dragonflies by eating larvae would have a positive effect on the bees, which would
Yeah.
have a positive effect on the flowers.
yeah, exactly. So if the fish it has a negative direct effect on the dragonfly larvae, right? So if it eats a bunch of larvae, it's going to reduce the population of adult dragonflies. And if we reduce that population, there's less predation pressure on the pollinators, so that population can grow. And then if there's more pollinators, they can interact with more plants and increase the pollination, having an end result. The more fish means more flowers potentially. And then the way Cogbooks showed that through the activities was through these types of diagrams, right? So, it asks like maybe there's always going to be an animal in between for the indirect effect. It might ask the question here, it asks, what happens to the density of owls if the density of grasshoppers decreases, right? So it's skipping that direct interaction of the mouse by leapfrogging and going back 2 steps to the grasshopper. So we can see the answer is decrease, but why? Why does the owl population decrease if we also have a decrease in the grasshopper population?
Well, wouldn't there be a decrease in the mouse population?
I agree, but why would there be a decrease in the mouse population? Because there's a decrease in the grasshopper.
Well, then there'll be no food for the mice, so that will decrease the mice
Yep.
population. And then if there's no mice, then that will decrease the owl population because that's their source of food.
Absolutely, right? It's affecting down the food chain. We have a decrease in the grasshopper, so it has limited food for the mouse, which will potentially crash that population, which then means less food for the owl. Exactly. What does that mean for the grass then?
The grass will increase.
Yeah, exactly, right? If the grasshopper population goes down, it's a predator to the grass. So 1 step back would mean the grass would probably increase in volume or density. Yeah, so there was one more activity with this. So this one was just same idea of the questions, just a little bit longer chain. If we increase or decrease one, it's going to have an effect one way, and it's going to have essentially the opposite effect the other way. Right, so just for example, if we increase the density of snakes, that's more food for the mongoose, so we can increase the mongoose population, but it also increases the predation pressure on the chameleon below it. Are there any questions with these 2 activities? Are there any other specific questions or topics that the group wanted to go over?
The only other thing that I had was the Locta Volterra model.
Sure.
I just wanted to know if I was gonna need to have how much of that equation I would need memorized. Cause it kept splitting off into different things, so.
Yeah, you won't have to have it memorized, I'll say. If you have a question on it, it'll have the equation, but you have to know what the parameters mean, the different parts of the equation. You won't have to do any calculations with it, like predicting any cycles with it.
Because I understand it once it gets on like the graph things that it gives you, but then the math part of it was a bit intense. I need to go over that again.
Yeah, I would be comfortable explaining what it means, but not enough to memorize the equation and be able to plug numbers into it. You won't have to do it that intense.
Okay.
And like you should know, like when it talks about like if a value for, like, say the predator is less than, like, understanding what would cause, like, the prey population will increase if, like, what is it? It's like P is less than R divided by C, and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that would be something worth knowing, like how would, which value would have to increase in order for the prey population to increase, or which value would decrease for the prey population or predator population to increase or decrease. So knowing how changing the values of the equation could potentially change the direction of the equation, or the direction of the output of the equation. Because we know that, for example, the MP part of the equation, that's the death rate, right? So if the death rate increases for the predator or the prey, the population is going to decrease. But it's going to be directional questions, not actual math.
By any chance, do you have any like random example? Because they didn't have any like activities or anything for that module. So I like just straight reading it is really hard for me to absorb the information, especially on a math thing.
Yeah, I'm looking at the exam right now just to see how close it gets to asking a question about it. So it's even more basic than, I'm not seeing anything on specifically on lockable Terra. It does have stuff on predator prey systems based on predator and prey densities. Like if one density changes, what would you expect the density of the other to be? That's a type of question you might see. Yeah, honestly, I wouldn't worry about the mathematical equations much at all. So there was, across the modules, it tried to have a common theme, right? One was on competition, mutualism, predation. So things to think about is how do those individually affect like species biodiversity? Are they good? Do they enhance biodiversity? Is it dependent, or do they tend to inhibit biodiversity?
Sorry, could you say that one more time?
Sure. So like these are across the modules, right? We had the three where we had the competition, mutualism, and predation. How do those relate to species biodiversity?
So
Individually.
like competition would, I mean, without being too specific, like, because it can cause like in a species, so intra specific competition could increase diversity, but inter-specific competition could decrease diversity.
It kind of goes back to like the effects too. Like how, I guess I'll ask, how would you said intra-specific competition?
Yeah, because they had like that divergence, like divergence in a species where they would split off and find new niches. It was, I can't remember, it was a module before this. But it was like directional selection versus converging selection and diverging selection.
Are you saying this goes back to like module 2 or?
I don't remember which model it was, I'm sorry.
But from a previous mod, that was, I believe.
Yeah, it's from a previous week.
So Cogworks pushed it that competition generally does not improve biodiversity because with competition, you always run the possibility of one species going extinct. So if they coexist, it's generally thought that competition, it kind of depends. Like if they coexist, it's going to stay even biodiversity. But if one wins out, it decreases biodiversity. So competition's net result is generally not good for biodiversity.
Okay.
And predation, that can be a one that it depends, because if it's a predator or a keystone species, predation can actually enhance biodiversity, right? Because if a predator is keeping competitors in check and not letting the dominant competitor outcompete the other competitors, predation can potentially be good, but predation can also be bad if the predator goes and kills everything, right? So that one is kind of, it depends. And then what about mutualism? How do we feel as a group about that as far as like species biodiversity? Is it good for it or bad for it?
Good for it.
Yeah, it's generally good for it, right? Because it provides species positive interactions across species. And provide multiple, like, increase food sources or protection or reduce disease levels by removing parasites. So yeah, so mutualism is generally good for biodiversity. Predation, it depends on how it plays out. It can be good or bad, and then competition is generally bad for biodiversity.
Is it fair to say, like, because you say like good, bad, bad overall, good overall, it makes me think of the pluses and minuses. Is it fair to say if it's like plus/minus, it kind of depends on how it goes? And if it's like all minus, then it's like generally bad, or is that oversimplifying it?
I mean, it's the same train of thought. The double negatives is generally going to be all bad. The double positive is going to be good. The plus minus, yeah, I mean, that would be a depends. As far as plus minus predation can be good, parasitism is usually not great, but it can keep populations in check too, depending on the situation. So as long as you have a way of kind of describing it or give an example, I think you could provide an answer for it. If it the plus minus is, again, I mean, I agree, it just depends on the scenario. So, but yeah, it kind of follows that trend that Cogworks was getting at too. And then outside of those three, T18 or module T18 talks about there's three other factors of the environment that promote diverse communities. Does anybody remember what those were?
You're
What
talking,
drives, what, so go ahead.
sorry, I was promoting increased biodiversity. I have like the ecosystem itself being more diverse, right?
Yeah,
Or-
so that would be like a diverse habitat, right?
yeah,
Yep, that tends to promote diversity in a community or biodiversity. And why is that? If we have a diverse habitat,
with more niches to fill.
exactly, right? Yeah, there's more different types of habitats, fill more niches, so that provides more opportunity for different types and thus more organisms to live in that general area. There's two other ones that Cogbooks listed off. We tend to think of competition as bad. What do organisms compete over?
Resources.
Yeah, so if there's abundant resources, right, in an environment, that can promote diversity in a community because it reduces that competition level. And also just having abundant resources, a variety of resources can provide different types of resources needed by different types of organisms, kind of like the habitat. And then the other one we've talked about a little bit, it mentioned was keystone species tend to promote diversity. Or species
That's not lumped in
biodiversity.
with competitors.
What was that?
That was not lumped in with competitors or competition or not.
Part of it's competition, part of it's predation. Like, so this is, I think, why it was the last module in this unit, is it introduced competition, predation, and mutualism separate. And now this is combining kind of some concepts. Because remember, we talked about a keystone species, a big part of it is it keeps competitors with that environment in check by being a predator itself. It doesn't allow lower level competition to get out of hand and one organism to move to its carrying capacity and push the other one to extinction. So it prevents that divergence that we saw in those graphs that we went over in the beginning. Or it prevents the ones that lead to extinction, I should say, and it promotes the one potentially that allows them to live in equilibrium or coexist.
So that kind of ties back into like the community stability, resistance, resilience thing that I talked about as well.
Yeah, so I mean, some of what determines stability is related to what we were talking about. How are you viewing it as linked though? Because if you wanna,
Well, like an abundant resources will increase stability and well, I mean, kind of.
I would agree with that. If a community has generally abundant resources, it can generally remain pretty stable. There's not gonna be population crashes.
And then like a keystone species improves the resistance to change because it's keeping things balanced.
Yeah, I would agree with that, that a keystone species would also promote stability as well in a community. Once it reaches its higher level of biodiversity, it'll keep it stable at that higher level. But we're talking about stability. If a community experiences a disturbance, does it always rebound or go back to its previous state?
I mean, not always, but it's more likely to.
Sure, it generally tends towards that or trends towards that, but say it can't reach that state again, what is that called?
Oh. Alternate stable state.
Yeah, an alternative stable state, exactly. So if something drastically changes, say, the soil pH, like a volcanic eruption maybe, or a flood that wipes away all the topsoil, it wants to go back to, its previous, very lush, diverse community, but if it doesn't have the resources or the resources change, it's going to be a different state, so an alternative stable state. It can still reach stability, but maybe the same, not as many plants or the same types of plants can't grow, but different plants or something might maybe come in and make it, a little bit different than before.
So could you say like wolves went like for Yellowstone's frequently used example, wolves were eliminated and then it reached a new alternative stable state, and now that they've reintroduced it, it's becoming another alternative stable state.
Yeah, I think that's a good example of that. I mean, it had a pretty stable state when the wolves were there. They were removed, it changed into something else. I don't think Cogbooks went into detail if it completely stabilized or not. I'm not sure if the science knows that, like if it would have kept drifting, but hypothetically, had it reached its new stable state, that would have been an alternative stable state. And bringing the wolves back in would have pushed it back towards the original. And depending on how drastic the environment changed, it may reach its original state or it might reach something close. And again, I don't know, we'd have to use some type of metric to quantify if it fully reached it back or not, but it could be 3 different alternative stable states, or it could go back to the original and just add the 2. And then there was one page, if we want to finish, I guess, talking about stable states of communities. There was one type of organism that was as its richness, as its species richness increased, it tend to have a positive effect and make multiple types of environments more stable. So like keystone species was kind of like one example we used, but this would be a type of organism. It gave 4 figures and showed how on the x-axis it had X species richness, and on the y-axis it had stability, like herbivores, predators, and they tended to level off at high levels when this type of organism was at high richness in the environment. There's only one page in Cogbooks, but it did make a point to talk about it.
You're not talking about like primary producers or like that.
Kind of. I mean, I'm having a hard time wording this without giving it away or making it too random. It's plants, right? So like it basically was plant species richness. As that increased, it tends to stabilize communities because different types of plants provide different food sources. They provide different types of shelter, nesting sites. So that, it has a kind of a ripple effect that the more different kind of plants you have, the more other organisms you also attract. So plant species diversity leads to animal species diversity. It leads to insect species diversity.
Kind of like bottom up control, but with diversity too.
Yeah. So talked about the figures. Yeah, I'll just show what I was talking about. So this is the page where it's showing plant species richness on the x-axis, and then it had herbivore species richness went up. There's a strong correlation with it. Predators also went up as plant species richness increases. So that's part of the topic of what makes a community stable.
Because plants are main original resource kind of a thing.
I think it does relate to what you're saying, like being a primary, producer, they're the bottom food source in most environments. So if the bottom's food source is bigger, and we're thinking of it as like a pyramid of diversity, the wider the base, the bigger the pyramid. So.
I'm like thinking about those ones where we had the line of like the grasshopper, chameleon, and all that. And if the bottom one increases, then everybody after that increases.
That too, yep. It's a good example, good point. Are there any other specific questions or topics we want to go over?
I'm good. Thank you.
Yep. I think this is a pretty good discussion. Covered a lot. And if nothing from anyone else, I think we'll go ahead and call it, and I will get working on uploading this. So give it about maybe an hour-ish or something for it to convert and upload from YouTube. All right. Talk to everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Night.